The air inside the wooden cabin smelled of stale tobacco, cold damp timber, and the sharp, chemical reek of kerosene spilling from the wick of my warning lamp. My name is Nick. Tell me, have you ever sat entirely alone in a wooden box perched on the side of a dead mountain in Pennsylvania at 3 in the morning, listening to the heavy timber walls groan under the pressure of 500 feet of solid rock? Most people think isolation is just a quiet place where nobody bothers you. They imagine a romantic retreat in the woods, a cabin where you can drink coffee, watch the rain fall through the pines, and enjoy the peaceful silence of the wilderness. They don't know what it's like to guard a hole in the earth that has no business being there. They don't know about the tunnel. Have you ever asked yourself why a multi-million-dollar railway expansion project carved straight through the heart of the Allegheny Mountains was completely abandoned back in 1952, leaving behind nothing but rusted tracks, unfinished concrete arches, and a locked iron gate? Let me tell you. It wasn't because of budget cuts or shifting politics. It was because the engineers realized too late that when you dig deep enough into the ancient stone of these mountains, you aren't just opening a path for trains. You are opening a door for things that were buried long before the first railroad tie was ever spiked into the dirt. Tonight was my shift at the North Portal. A heavy, corrugated tin and wood trailer parked 50 yards away from the massive mouth of the unfinished bore, smelling of rust and old grease. My job was simple, mechanical, and entirely physical. Tend the red warning lanterns along the timber scaffolding. Check the massive iron security chains bolted across the entrance. And if the mountain winds whipped up a sudden rockslide or a blinding blizzard, pull the heavy steel latch and drop the secondary barricade before the cave-in reached the valley. My fingers were calloused, blackened with soot and machine oil from constantly trimming the wicks of the kerosene lamps that flickered against the pitch-black void of the tunnel mouth. Outside the thin plywood walls of my cabin, the wind was howling down the mountain pass, driving a freezing, relentless rain against the glass panes until they rattled like loose teeth in a skull. I stood up from my squeaky metal cot, grabbed my heavy canvas utility jacket, and hoisted my kerosene lantern by its wire handle. The floorboards groaned beneath my work boots as I shoved the door open against the violent pressure of the mountain gale. The night air hit my face like a slab of wet ice. I stepped out onto the gravel platform, lifting the lantern high to check the red hazard lamps flickering along the wooden trestles. Everything looked normal. Just the black maw of the unlit tunnel yawning wide into the cliffside, swallowing the rain and the wind into its deep, suffocating belly. And then, from somewhere deep within the absolute darkness of the unfinished bore, miles past the point where the concrete lining ended and the raw, jagged rock began, I heard the sound of iron wheels rolling over steel. The sound did not come from the valley below, nor did it rattle down the winding logging roads behind the cabin. It came from the dark. A sharp, metallic clatter of heavy steel wheels striking iron joints, echoing against the damp, unfinished rock walls of the mountain bore with the distinct, undeniable rhythm of a massive freight locomotive picking up speed in an empty vault. My boots froze on the wet gravel. Have you ever listened to a sound that your brain instantly rejected because it contradicted every single physical law of the world you thought you understood? People always talk about believing their own eyes and ears, as if our senses were infallible instruments of truth. They walk through life confident that what they hear must have a logical, mechanical explanation. A truck shifting gears on a distant highway. A falling boulder echoing through a ravine. A crew of late-night workers hammering steel ties together in the dark. We invent comforting little excuses to keep the terror at bay, refusing to accept that sometimes a sound exists in a place where its cause was ripped out and thrown away decades ago. I lowered the kerosene lantern, the yellow flame sputtering wildly inside its glass cage as a vicious gust of mountain wind tore across the platform. The rails inside the tunnel were gone. I knew that layout better than I knew my own name. When the Pennsylvania Railroad abandoned the project back in 1952, salvage crews had stripped every single foot of steel tracking out of the bore, hauling the heavy rails away on flatbed trucks to be melted down for scrap metal. There was nothing inside that tunnel except bare, weeping limestone, loose gravel, and stagnant puddles of rainwater. There were no tracks. There were no wheels. There were no trains. And yet, the terrifying, rhythmic clack-clack, clack-clack of heavy iron rolling over steel grew louder, sharper, and heavier with every passing second, marching steadily outward from the pitch-black heart of the mountain. Think about how fragile our sense of reality really is. We build our lives around neat, orderly systems of logic, schedules, and physical barriers, convinced that the past is safely locked away behind us like a train parked in a dead-end siding. We assume that what is gone stays gone. Then you stand alone on a gravel platform at 3 in the morning, listening to a ghost locomotive thunder down an empty corridor of stone where no tracks have existed for a quarter of a century. And you realize the past isn't resting quietly in a museum. It's just waiting for the right moment to roll back down the line. The ground beneath my work boots began to vibrate. A low, subterranean hum rippled up through the gravel and shale, making the iron chains on the massive security gate rattle with a sharp, metallic shriek. My fingers tightened around the wire handle of the kerosene lantern until my knuckles turned stark white. I turned my head toward the gaping black mouth of the tunnel, lifting the lantern higher to cut through the swirling rain and the thick mist pouring out of the bore. The darkness inside the mountain wasn't just empty space anymore. It was shifting. A pale, sickly yellow light, dim, flickering, and entirely unnatural, began to bleed out from the deep curves of the unfinished rock tunnel, casting long, twisting shadows across the wooden scaffolding. And right behind the light, moving with an unstoppable, terrifying momentum, came the high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek of steel brakes grinding against iron wheels in the dark. The pale, sickly yellow light did not beam outward the way a modern locomotive headlight cuts through a foggy night. It glowed with a dull, stagnant intensity, like a dying coal trapped beneath a thick layer of wet ash, casting a sickly jaundice across the jagged, weeping limestone walls of the mountain bore. The shrieking of metal grinding against metal grew so violently loud that it forced my teeth to ache, sending a sharp, electric shock straight down my jawbone. Have you ever stared down a long, dark stretch of road or track at night, convincing yourself that the distant glare of an oncoming light is just a car or a routine signal, right before you realize it's moving way too fast and making a sound that defies every law of mechanics? People always laugh at ghost stories around a campfire. They sip their coffee, poke at the embers, and joke about optical illusions, wind echoing through canyons, or the nervous trickery of an overactive imagination working overtime in the dark. They believe the physical world is an immovable fortress. They think stone, iron, and gravity are absolute rules that can never be broken by anything supernatural or forgotten. They never stop to consider what happens when a machine built by men who died 50 years ago decides to finish its journey through a mountain that was never meant to be conquered. I didn't run back into the safety of the plywood cabin. My boots seemed glued to the wet gravel platform, rooted by a terrifying, morbid curiosity that paralyzed every muscle in my legs. The vibration rolling up through the earth was no longer just a hum. It was a violent, rhythmic pounding that rattled the heavy iron security gate, making the thick steel chains clank and groan against the massive padlocks as if an invisible fist were slamming repeatedly against the bars from the inside. Clack clack. Clack clack. The sound of iron wheels striking steel ties echoed out of the tunnel mouth with deafening clarity, despite the glaring, undeniable truth that there were no rails left inside that bore. The salvage crews had ripped every single yard of track out of the mountain in 1952. I knew the blueprints by heart. I had walked that dark tunnel with a flashlight during my first week on the job, shining the beam over bare, unpaved stone floors where rusted spike holes were the only evidence that heavy industry had ever passed this way. And yet, right there in the pitch-black void, something heavy, massive, and entirely invisible was rolling forward at full throttle. Think about how much of our lives are spent trusting things that aren't there anymore. We trust old contracts, rusted railways, abandoned mines, and forgotten promises left behind by generations that turned to dust long before we were born. We walk across the earth acting like we are the first ones to leave footprints, completely ignoring the hollow spaces beneath our feet where the old ghosts are still keeping score. Then you hear a train running on air. Then you see a yellow light burning in a tunnel that was sealed off from the world before your parents were even children. And you realize the past never really leaves the mountain. It just waits for a lonely watchman to forget to lock the gate. The yellow light surged forward, spilling out of the tunnel mouth and washing over the rain-slicked gravel platform with blinding intensity. The air turned instantly freezing cold, dropping 40 degrees in a single heartbeat, turning my ragged breath into thick clouds of white vapor that vanished into the howling wind. And right at the edge of the tunnel entrance, where the rusted iron security gate hung between two massive concrete pillars, the invisible locomotive hit an invisible barrier. A deafening explosion of metal-on-metal impact ripped through the night, a sound so violent and sharp it felt like a bolt of lightning striking an empty anvil right beside my ear. The heavy steel chains locking the gate snapped like dry twigs. The heavy steel chains locking the gate did not just snap. They shattered into a shower of jagged, glowing metal fragments that sprayed across the wet gravel platform like deadly shrapnel from a bursting artillery shell, tearing through the air with a vicious, piercing shriek that pierced deep into the ear canals. One thick link of oxidized iron whipped past my cheek with a sharp, whining hiss, slicing clean through the sleeve of my canvas jacket and grazing the bleeding skin of my shoulder before burying itself deep into the wooden wall of the trailer behind me with a sickening thud, leaving a smoking, splintered crater behind. Have you ever witnessed something so violently impossible that your brain completely short-circuits, refusing to process the data your eyes are feeding it? People always assume that in a moment of extreme terror, a human being will either fight like a cornered beast or run like a chased animal. They watch movies and read books where heroes dive out of the way of explosions, shouting brave warnings and making split-second tactical decisions in the dead of night. They don't know the reality of absolute shock. They don't know what it feels like when your knees turn to water, your chest locks up, and your mind simply stalls out, leaving you standing frozen in the middle of a catastrophe like a deer caught in the headlights of a car that isn't even there. The massive iron security gate, 300 pounds of welded steel bars designed to withstand rockslides and heavy winter storms, swung outward on its hinges with a deafening groan that set my teeth vibrating in my skull. It didn't swing open because someone turned a key. It was blown wide open by the sheer, concussive pressure of an invisible mass slamming into it at 60 miles per hour, bending the thick steel struts like hot wax. A wall of freezing, hyper-pressurized air roared out of the tunnel mouth right behind the gate, carrying a stench so foul, corrupt, and ancient it made my stomach heave instantly, forcing bitter, acidic bile up into the back of my throat. It smelled like stagnant swamp water, sulfur, rusted iron filings, and the unmistakable, suffocating odor of scorched coal smoke trapped underground for a quarter of a century, thick enough to choke the life out of anyone breathing it. I coughed violently, bringing my forearm up to cover my face as the freezing gale tore the kerosene lantern out of my grip. The lamp hit the gravel, the glass globe shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces, and the spilled fuel ignited instantly against a hot spark from the broken chains, sending a tongue of yellow flame licking up the side of the wooden trailer. Think about how fragile our safety measures really are. We bolt doors, we padlock gates, we build concrete retaining walls, and we string up warning lanterns, convincing ourselves that we have successfully separated our civilized lives from the wild, chaotic forces of the earth. We trust in locks and chains to keep the dark things outside where they belong. Then a ghost train comes roaring down an empty railway bore, smashing through 300-pound steel barriers as if they were made of rotten matchsticks. And you realize every single wall we build is just a joke written on a napkin. Through the curtain of blowing rain, smoke, and flickering firelight, I forced my burning eyes open and stared straight into the dark interior of the tunnel. There was nothing tangible there. No steel engine block, no boiler, no cowcatcher, no massive driving wheels resting on iron rails. Just an empty, rushing vacuum of compressed air and absolute darkness, moving forward with the unstoppable momentum of a freight locomotive, carving a visible trough through the heavy rain and mist. And right at the front of that invisible rush, suspended in midair just inches above the ground where the tracks used to be, two twin headlights burned with that dull, sickly yellow glare. Staring directly at me. The twin yellow headlights hovered in the freezing mountain air, suspended over the bare, unpaved gravel where the steel rails had been ripped out 20 years before, their unblinking glare boring directly into my dilated pupils like hot needles. They did not flicker. They did not waver. They burned with a steady, oppressive, asphyxiating glare that seemed to swallow the light of the burning kerosene spreading up the side of my trailer, choking the air of any remaining oxygen. Have you ever stood in the middle of a dense winter fog and felt completely convinced that something was standing right in front of you, breathing down your neck, even though your eyes could see nothing but gray mist? People always talk about the comfort of visibility. They believe that if they can just turn on a bright enough light, every monster will crawl back into the dark and every mystery will be solved by the cold logic of day. They rely on flashlights, headlights, and neon street lamps to make them feel safe in a world they barely understand. They don't know what happens when a light doesn't illuminate the dark, but instead reveals how little of the dark actually belongs to us, exposing the helpless panic trapped beneath our skin. A thick, billowing cloud of white steam vented from the empty air directly beneath the twin yellow lights, hissing loudly as it hit the freezing rain falling on the gravel platform. The heat of that steam was blistering, searing the raw flesh of my cheeks. Even standing 10 feet away, I could feel the intense thermal wave scorching the damp wool of my jacket, turning the ice on my skin into a scalding mist that stung my neck and face with agonizing intensity. The sound of heavy iron machinery working under immense pressure filled the mountain pass, the rhythmic hiss-chug of pistons driving invisible iron rods, accompanied by the deep, resonant groaning of a massive boiler straining against its rivets until it felt ready to rupture and spray hot shrapnel. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird suffocating in a cage. My hands were empty now, the lantern broken and burning on the ground, leaving me with nothing to defend myself against a machine made entirely of pressure, steam, and memory. Think about how much energy we waste trying to bury our mistakes. When a project fails, when a tunnel gets sealed off because the cost in human lives becomes too high to write down on a public ledger, we think we can just walk away. We lock the iron gate, put up a "no trespassing" sign, and pretend that whatever happened behind that mountain wall never existed. We assume that time acts as an eraser, wiping away the blood, the sweat, and the iron until the earth goes back to sleep. Then the whistle blows, tearing through the quiet like a rusted blade. Then the ghost engine rolls out of the dark, demanding to know why the track was pulled up before the run was finished. The invisible locomotive didn't stop at the broken gate. It crept forward, inch by agonizing, terrifying inch, sliding past the shattered concrete pillars and out onto the open platform where I stood frozen against the side of the burning trailer, paralyzed by a creeping dread. The air grew so hot, so thick with the chemical stench of burning coal tar and sulfur, that my lungs felt like they were filling up with hot ash, choking me from the inside out. And right beside my shoulder, floating in the freezing rain just inches from my face, the heavy, metallic smell of fresh engine oil and iron filings grew so intense it made my eyes water and sting with burning pain. Something massive was passing right beside me. Something that weighed hundreds of tons, yet made no sound against the gravel except for the dry, scraping slide of an invisible flange riding over bare stone, sending violent shivers down my spine. I turned my head slowly, my muscles screaming in protest, forcing my gaze toward the empty space beside the trailer. The rain falling through that space didn't hit the ground as water. It turned to steam the moment it crossed an invisible boundary in the air, rising in a thick, swirling white cloud that shaped itself into the towering, cylindrical flank of an old steam locomotive boiler. The towering flank of the invisible boiler hissed violently as the freezing mountain rain hit its superheated metal shell, turning the water into scalding clouds of white steam that wrapped around my body like a suffocating shroud. I couldn't move. My boots felt welded to the gravel platform, my back pressed so hard against the blistering wooden planks of the burning trailer that I could feel the heat of the spreading fire eating away at the wall behind me. Have you ever tried to run away from something when your legs felt like they were filled with wet concrete, every single step requiring more strength than you actually possessed? People always talk about the instinct of self-preservation as if it were a switch that turns on automatically the second danger appears. They imagine themselves diving out of harm's way, sprinting down the mountain trail, or fighting back with furious adrenaline pumping through their veins. They don't understand the crushing weight of pure, unadulterated dread. They don't know what it feels like when terror locks your joints, numbs your fingers, and convinces your brain that running is entirely pointless because whatever is hunting you already occupies every square inch of the space around you. The massive, invisible engine crept forward past the platform, its rhythmic piston strokes pounding a steady, thunderous beat into the subterranean rock of the mountain. The heavy, metallic pulse filled the air with a deep, echoing roar that vibrated straight through my chest, while the continuous hiss of escaping steam drowned out the howling of the mountain wind. With every stroke, the ground beneath my feet trembled violently, sending shockwaves up through my legs that made my teeth chatter in my jaw. And then, right behind the towering boiler, the heavy, shadowy outline of the engineer's cab drifted slowly past my field of vision. The cab was completely open to the elements, just like every freight locomotive built in the late 40s before enclosed steel cabs became standard safety regulations across the Pennsylvania lines. And standing inside that empty space, bathed in the pale, sickly yellow glare of the instrument panel lights that floated in mid-air, was a man. Think about how easily a life can be erased from the world when it ends where nobody is looking. A rockslide deep inside an unventilated mountain bore. A sudden structural collapse that buries a crew of 300 workers beneath tons of jagged limestone before anyone on the surface even realizes the roof has given way. The company doesn't send rescue teams when the cost is too high. They don't dig out the bodies. They simply seal the north portal with concrete and steel, change the maps, mark the project as a total loss, and pretend that the men who died down in the dark never existed in the first place. We walk across the earth confident that our names are written in permanent ink. We forget how thin the crust is between the living world and a mass grave sealed up behind a locked iron gate. The man in the cab wasn't wearing a modern railway uniform. He wore a heavy, grease-stained denim jacket, a faded blue work shirt, and a greasy black cap pulled low over his forehead to keep the soot out of his eyes. He stood with one heavy hand resting on the brass throttle lever that hung suspended in empty air, his body swaying with the rolling momentum of the invisible engine. As the cab drifted slowly past where I stood pinned against the burning trailer, the engineer turned his head. He didn't have a face. Where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of dark, scorched skin that looked precisely like charred wood covered in a thick layer of engine grease and coal dust. And yet, I could feel him looking right at me. "You missed a spot on the chain, boy," a voice rasped inside my head, not a sound traveling through the air, but a direct, agonizing vibration echoing against the inside of my skull like a telegraph key clicking in an empty room. The 1952 run isn't finished yet. The rails are waiting down in the dark. ## Chapter 7, The Descent into the Unlaid Track. The engineer's hand remained resting upon the floating brass throttle, his faceless, charcoal-blackened head turned fully toward me as the massive weight of the invisible locomotive continued its slow, inexorable roll past the gravel platform. The air around me was no longer just hot, it was thick, heavy, and choked with the dense, suffocating aroma of old coal gas and boiling boiler water. Have you ever stood on the edge of a steep precipice in the dead of night, feeling that terrifying, irrational urge to lean just a fraction of an inch further into the empty air. People call it the call of the void. That strange, morbid whisper in the back of your mind that makes you question your own grip on reality, wondering what it would feel like to let go of the safety rail and surrender to gravity. We spend our entire lives fighting against that pull, building fences, locking doors, and reciting comforting rules to convince ourselves that we are safe. We refuse to accept how easy it is to slip from the world of the living into the vast, quiet machinery of the forgotten. I tried to turn my head away from the engineer, but my neck muscles were locked as rigid as if they had been forged out of the same cold iron as the engine chassis. The trailer behind me crackled loudly as the fire ate deeper into the plywood walls, sending up a shower of bright orange sparks that died out the moment they crossed the thermal boundary of the steam cloud. And then, the invisible locomotive began to slow its rhythmic pace. The heavy, metallic pulse of the pistons dropped from a steady, rolling thunder to a slow, heavy chug, echoing off the jagged limestone walls of the mountain bore. Hiss. Chug. Hiss. Chug. The engine stopped right at the mouth of the tunnel. Directly in front of the black, yawning void where the tracks ended and the mountain swallowed the light. Think about how much of our lives are governed by paths that were laid down by other people long before we were born. We follow the roads they paved, we work the jobs they left behind, and we walk the corridors they designed, never once stopping to ask where those tracks actually lead when they run out of steel. We assume that when a path ends, we stop walking. We assume there is a hard boundary between the finished world and the unfinished dark. Then you stand alone on a mountain pass at 3 in the morning, and you realize the tracks don't need to exist on the ground for a train to carry you away. A heavy, iron-shod boot stepped down from the empty air of the cab, landing on the wet gravel platform with a sharp, echoing crunch that vibrated straight through the soles of my work boots. There was nothing visible standing there. Just the deep, compressed footprint appearing instantly in the wet stones, followed immediately by a second step as the engineer descended from his machine. The suffocating smell of scorched coal dust and wet engine oil washed over me in a tidal wave, so intense that I could taste the metallic tang of iron filings on the back of my tongue. The invisible presence moved closer. I couldn't see a body, but I could feel the displacement of the air, the heavy, crushing pressure of a man 6 feet tall wearing a denim jacket and a greasy work cap, stepping into the space right in front of me. The shift is never over until the run is logged, Nick, the voice echoed inside my skull, dry and rasping like autumn leaves crushed beneath a heavy rail tie. You locked the gate, but you forgot to check the manifest. A large, cold hand, completely invisible to the eye, yet possessing the absolute, unyielding weight of a slab of cast iron, closed firmly around my right wrist. The skin beneath its grip didn't feel like flesh. It felt smooth, dry, and unnaturally cold, like touching the surface of an old photograph that had been buried in a damp basement for half a century. I tried to pull my arm back, but my muscles were completely unresponsive, locked in place by the same terrifying paralysis that had kept me pinned against the burning trailer since the very first whistle blew. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the freedom to move your fingers across the keys or turn the pages of a book. Look at the warmth in your skin, the steady beat of your pulse, the familiar walls of the room holding you safe. How long do you think that safety will last once the night gets quiet and the old machinery starts moving down in the dark? We are all just watchmen waiting for a shift that doesn't belong to us. The engineer's cold, invisible grip tightened around my wrist, pulling me forward step by step away from the burning trailer, away from the safety of the valley, and straight toward the black, gaping mouth of the mountain tunnel where the yellow lights were waiting in the dark. The cold, absolute pressure of the invisible hand locked around my wrist like a jagged shackle forged in a freezing mountain smithy, cutting into the trembling flesh as it violently dragged me forward across the wet gravel toward the yawning, black, suffocating maw of the unpaved tunnel. The heat of the burning trailer behind us faded away instantly, swallowed by the immense, oppressive dampness of the mountain interior that closed around us like a tightening throat. Have you ever walked into a deep, abandoned cave or a disused mine shaft late at night, long after the tourists have gone and the electric lights have been switched off, feeling the air turn suddenly dead and lethal? People always talk about darkness as the absence of light. They imagine it as a soft, passive shadow that you can easily push back with a flashlight or a match. They don't know what it's like to encounter a darkness that has weight, texture, and a predatory intent of its own, wrapping around your throat like a cold hand. A darkness that doesn't just hide things, but actively presses against your skin, filling your nose with the sickening smell of wet limestone and ancient, stagnant air that hasn't seen the sun since the ice ages, suffocating every breath. We crossed the threshold where the concrete lining ended and the raw, jagged rock began. The ground beneath my work boots changed instantly from loose gravel to hard, damp shale that felt slippery underfoot, slick with a fine film of mineral slime leaking from the weeping walls above. There were no rails. There were no wooden ties, no crushed ballast stone, and no steel spikes driven into the floor. Just an empty, unpaved corridor of naked stone stretching straight into the heart of the mountain, into absolute, impenetrable blackness that seemed to claw at your eyes. And yet, right beside us, the rhythmic, thunderous pulse of the invisible steam engine continued to beat with terrifying, chest-crushing regularity. Chug hiss. Chug hiss. The sound bounced off the wet stone walls, multiplying into a deafening chorus of metallic echoes that vibrated directly against my skull, making my teeth ache, my brain rattle, and my vision blur at the edges into total darkness. Think about how deeply we trust the infrastructure built around us. We assume that every tunnel has a destination, that every railway leads to a town where people are waiting with warm coffee and open doors, and that every abandoned project is just a dead monument to a bygone era. We never consider what happens when a tunnel doesn't lead out of the mountain, but leads deeper into it, trapping you forever in its stony jaws. We walk along thinking we are exploring history, completely ignoring the fact that history sometimes explores us back, tearing into our flesh to see what we are made of. The invisible engineer halted his steady march just past the 50-foot mark inside the bore. His cold, iron grip released my wrist, but the moment my hand was free, a heavy, leather-bound volume materialized out of the thin air, dropping with a dull, echoing thud onto a flat shelf of limestone jutting out from the tunnel wall like a tombstone. It wasn't a modern ledger. It was an old, thick record book bound in cracked black sheepskin, its edges stained with grease, soot, and what looked unmistakably like dark, oxidized blood and iron gall ink. The twin yellow headlights of the invisible locomotive shifted their glare, casting a sickly, jaundiced beam directly across the cover of the book. Embossed across the leather in faded, peeling gold leaf were the words: Pennsylvania Railroad, North Portal Log, 1952. "Open it, Nick," the rasping voice echoed inside my mind, cold and dry as autumn leaves scraping across a concrete platform, digging into my thoughts with malicious glee. "You're the night watchman. It's time to log the final arrival." I looked down at my hands. The skin across my knuckles had lost its normal color, turning a pale, parchment gray under the sickly yellow light, perfectly matching the texture of the pages waiting inside the book as necrosis set in. My fingers didn't tremble anymore. The terror hadn't vanished, it had simply frozen solid, replaced by the crushing, inevitable realization that every shift I had pulled in that wooden cabin over the past 6 months wasn't a job, but a slow sentence to hell. It was an apprenticeship in agony. I reached out with fingers that felt light, hollow, and dry as paper, and gripped the damp, cold edge of the black leather cover, feeling it pulse with a sickening, biological heartbeat of its own. The moment my fingertips brushed against the damp, cold surface of the black sheepskin cover, a sharp, electric jolt shot straight up my arm, tearing through my veins like molten lead and making every single muscle in my body lock rigid with an instantaneous, paralyzing shock that left me gasping for air. It did not feel like touching an ordinary book bound in cured hide and glue. It felt precisely like pressing your bare hand against a sheet of raw, uninsulated copper wire carrying 10,000 volts of direct current straight from a municipal generator, frying the nerves beneath my skin. Have you ever touched a dead body shortly after the heart has stopped pumping? People always talk about how cold a corpse feels, as if death were simply a matter of the room temperature dropping a few degrees. That is not the real horror of it. The true, stomach-churning horror of touching the dead is the absolute, unnerving absence of friction. The skin feels too smooth, too flat, too entirely disconnected from anything that ever possessed a pulse or a drop of warm blood, sending a sickening wave of nausea straight up your throat. It feels like touching a wax replica of a human being that was left out in the rain too long until all the life was washed completely out of the clay, leaving only a hollow shell of rot. "Sign it," the invisible engineer repeated, his voice dropping an octave, resonating like a heavy iron bell struck in an empty vault, vibrating with a malicious, crushing weight that threatened to burst my eardrums. The pale, sickly yellow headlights of the unseen locomotive flared violently, turning a brilliant, blinding shade of amber that cast long, claw-like shadows across the weeping limestone walls of the mountain bore. The heat radiating from the invisible boiler was no longer just baking the air, it was pressing against my back like a physical wall of solid flame, scorching the fabric of my work shirt, blistering the raw flesh beneath, and singeing the hairs on the back of my neck. I couldn't pull my hand away. My fingers were magnetically fused to the damp black leather, locked in place by some unseen, terrifying pressure that defied every law of anatomy and physics, crushing my bones together. My right hand rose, trembling so hard the bones felt as though they were rattling loose inside my skin, and gripped the front cover of the ledger. With a slow, agonizingly loud rip, like dry adhesive tearing away from rusted metal, echoing sharply in the confined space, the heavy cover lifted. Think about the secrets you have kept hidden away in the deepest, darkest corners of your mind. The mistakes you made when nobody was watching, the promises you broke when it became convenient, the people you walked away from because saving yourself was easier than saving them. You spend your entire life locking those memories away in a mental vault, convincing yourself that if you don't look at them, they stop existing. You think your past is a private book that only you have the right to read. Then you stand in a dark mountain tunnel at 3 in the morning, and you realize the ledger has been keeping score of every single breath you ever wasted, choking the life out of your future. The pages inside the black book did not turn like normal paper. They flipped themselves over with a frantic, rushing snap, turning faster and faster in a blur of gray pulp and dark, smeared ink until the entire volume trembled violently on the limestone shelf. Dozens of pages. Hundreds of pages. 50 years of unrecorded tunnel accidents, lost construction crews, and forgotten night shifts, soaked in eternal agony. Suddenly, the frantic motion stopped. The pages locked dead open right in the middle of the heavy volume. Page 58. I forced my burning, bloodshot eyes to look down at the open expanse of paper illuminated by the yellow headlight glare. There were no other names on the page. No long lists of laborers, no stray engineers, no victims of the mountain. Just a single line of handwriting written in that exact same frantic, oxidized iron gall ink that I had watched bleed out of the 1952 records. My name. And directly beneath it, a blank space the exact size of a human thumbprint, waiting for a seal of eternal damnation. "Your shift is almost over, Nick," the engineer whispered, his voice vibrating directly against the bones of my skull like a telegraph key clicking in an empty room, mocking my absolute helplessness. "Just press your thumb to the ink. And the record will be complete." The space on page 58 was not merely empty paper waiting for a mark. It was a deep depression in the fibrous gray pulp, a thin, shallow groove pressed into the center of the heavy ledger page that looked precisely like the impression left by a heavy iron seal pushed into cooling red wax, pulsating with a sickening, biological rhythm. My right thumb hovered inches above the dark, glistening smear of oxidized iron gall ink shining in the sickly yellow glare of the invisible locomotive headlights, burning my skin before it even touched the page. Have you ever pressed your finger against something when you knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that doing so meant you could never take it back, sealing your soul in an inescapable cage? Like signing a confession for a crime you didn't commit just to make the interrogation stop, or stepping off the edge of a high cliff because you were too exhausted to fight the gravity pulling you down to your violent end. Most people go through life believing they always have a choice. They think freedom is a permanent state of being, a wide-open highway where you can turn the steering wheel at any moment and drive off in a completely different direction. They refuse to accept that every small, insignificant decision we make is actually just laying down another brick in a suffocating tunnel that only leads to one brutal place. I won't do it, I breathed, my voice trembling so hard the words fractured into dry, raspy coughs that tasted of cold dust, choking rust, and damp mountain stone. The invisible engineer did not move an inch. The oppressive weight of his presence remained fixed beside me, burning with that steady, merciless heat that drew its fuel straight from the roaring, unseen firebox of the ghost engine idling in the dark, sucking every last fraction of oxygen from the air. He didn't try to force my hand down with brute, panicked strength. He simply waited with the infinite, crushing patience of a man who had been standing in this unventilated limestone bore for 24 years, watching living watchmen break themselves against the weight of the municipal logs until their minds shattered. "You don't have to choose, Nick," he whispered, his voice vibrating directly against the bones of my skull like a telegraph key clicking in an empty room, mocking my paralysis. "The book was written before you were even hired for the night shift. You are just signing your own name to the bottom of a page that dried a long time ago. Think about how much of your life is actually dictated by things you had zero control over. The town you were born in, the family name you inherited, the damp wooden trailer on the side of a dead mountain you ended up working in because the pay was steady and the hours matched your loneliness. We walk around acting like independent authors, clutching our little lanterns and writing our stories out on clean sheets of paper. Then the ink starts bleeding like fresh wounds. Then the pages start turning themselves with violent snaps. And you look down to realize your entire existence was just an overdue shift that the mountain was waiting to close out with lethal finality. My right hand began to descend. It wasn't my brain sending the signal. It was the heavy, downward gravity of the ledger itself, pulling my arm like an iron weight attached to a winch, dislocating my shoulder in a silent agony. My thumb inched closer and closer to the wet, dark smear of ink waiting in the center of page 58. The heat behind us surged again. A massive, deafening roar echoed down the narrow rock corridor as the unseen steam boiler blew its iron valves wide open on their own, belching a tidal wave of thick, oily black smoke and violent, scalding steam straight toward us, searing the flesh from our bones. The engine was moving again. It wasn't idling 10 feet away anymore. It was rolling forward at terrifying speed, its massive, invisible driving wheels crushing the loose gravel into dust, stretching out long, crushing bounds to block the only path left behind us as the air grew furnace hot. We were completely trapped between the dead engineer and the roaring beast of the bore. My thumb touched the ink. It didn't feel cold. It didn't feel wet. It felt boiling hot, like pressing bare skin against a freshly welded seam of structural steel, instantly searing my flesh to the page. A sharp, blinding flash of white light exploded behind my eyes, drowning out the tunnel, the ledger, the yellow headlights, and the roaring steam, leaving behind only the sound of a heavy iron gate slamming shut from the outside and locking me in forever. The white flash behind my eyes did not burn out. It compressed itself into a blinding, relentless glare that seemed to strip away the mountain, the limestone walls of the bore, and the cold Pennsylvania rain entirely, leaving nothing behind except a vast, infinite expanse of stark, unyielding white paper that choked my lungs with dry dust. My right thumb remained pressed flat against the damp, boiling center of the seal on page 58, searing my flesh into the pulp. Have you ever experienced that strange, disorienting moment right before you wake up from a deep, suffocating nightmare, where you know you are asleep, yet you cannot force your eyes to open while something foul presses on your chest? You struggle against the dead weight of your own limbs, screaming silently inside your head as terror tears your vocal cords, praying for the morning light to break through the window and shatter the gripping horror. Most people trust that waking up is guaranteed. They believe reality is a safe harbor they can always return to once the dream gets too dark to bear and the walls begin to cave in. They never consider the possibility that the dream might be the only real thing left, and that the waking world was just a temporary lie you told yourself to keep from going completely mad in the dark. The pain in my thumb began to spread, turning into a white-hot agony that made my vision swim with black spots. It wasn't a sharp, stinging cut from a paper edge or a simple thermal burn from a stray coal, but a corrosive rot eating my soul. It was an internal, systemic erosion, a deep, chemical change spreading outward from the point of contact, racing up my wrist, flooding my veins, and replacing my warm blood with that thick, oxidized iron gall ink that choked my pulse. I tried to pull my hand back, but my fingers were no longer my own, trapped in an iron vice. They had stiffened, darkened, and lost all their living flexibility, turning the exact same gray, fibrous shade as the heavy ledger pages fluttering wildly around my head like trapped birds. Think about how fiercely we protect our identities while we are alive. We guard our names, our reputations, our credit scores, and our little personal histories as if they were sacred relics bestowed upon us by the gods. We fight tooth and nail to make sure people remember who we were, what we achieved, and where we walked before the shadows took us. Then you stand in a room where the ink is alive, and you realize that a name is nothing more than a temporary label slapped onto a container of fuel waiting to be slaughtered. Once the fuel is burned, the label goes into the fire with it to burn in eternal agony. The roar of the unseen steam boiler had grown deafening, tearing at my eardrums until blood trickled from my ears. It was no longer echoing from the end of a distant rock corridor, it was vibrating directly inside the marrow of my bones, splintering them from within. The invisible engineer had closed the distance completely, pinning me in place. I couldn't see him anymore, the blinding white light and the dense, oily black smoke had merged into a swirling vortex of total occlusion, but I could feel his massive, charred hand resting heavily upon my right shoulder, crushing my collarbone to dust. It felt like a slab of cooling cast iron settling onto my back. "The entry is complete, Nick," a voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating with lethal malice. It wasn't the dead engineer speaking now. It was the mountain itself, hungry and relentless. The voice of the unventilated bore, whispering of eternal damnation. The voice of every unclaimed worker whose bones had been sealed up behind the concrete north portal since 1952, screaming in unison. The heavy black leather ledger snapped shut beneath my hand with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot inside an empty tunnel, fracturing my fingers as it closed. The white light vanished instantly, plunging me back into absolute horror. The stark emptiness dissolved into suffocating darkness. And I found myself standing once again in the freezing, dimly lit chamber of the unfinished rock bore, staring directly into the open, roaring mouth of the ghost engine's firebox as it prepared to consume me whole. The open mouth of the cast iron firebox did not glow with ordinary orange flames. It burned with a deep, violet-tinged heat that smelled intensely of scorched coal tar, sulfur, and wet, decaying paper pulp, radiating a thermal wave that made the air shimmer like a distorted wall of glass while suffocating my lungs with toxic ash. My right hand was still locked in place, resting flat against the heavy black leather of the ledger that now lay wedged upon the metal lip of the engine's access door, binding my flesh to the cursed page in agonizing torment. Have you ever looked closely at the glowing embers inside a wood stove late at night, watching how the red-hot coals slowly crumble and collapse into fine, gray powder as they disintegrate into nothingness? You think about how much energy, how much heat, and how much fierce, crackling life it took to turn a solid piece of hardwood into a handful of worthless dust while screaming in soundless agony. People look at destruction as an ending. We mourn the things that burn down, the buildings that collapse, the records that get lost to the ash. We assume that once fire touches an object, its story is finished forever, wiped out in a cruel display of absolute annihilation. We never stop to consider that burning might actually be the moment a story finally achieves its permanent, torturous form in the flames. I tried to pull my right hand back from the ledger, but my fingers refused to obey the commands of my brain, paralyzed by a creeping numbness. The skin across my knuckles had turned a pale, parchment-like gray, the fine lines of my fingerprints blurring and dissolving into the dark, oxidized iron gall ink that had soaked straight through my skin during the signature, rotting the muscle beneath. I wasn't bleeding red anymore. Every time my heart pulsed against my ribs, it pumped a thick, dark stream of liquid ink up my arm, staining the cuffs of my canvas jacket with permanent black streaks that burned like acid. The engineer in the 1940s work cap was gone. The tunnel behind me was empty, pitch black, and silent, save for the low, rhythmic mechanical breathing of the steam pistons feeding the beast in the center of the bore like a predatory heartbeat. And from inside the roaring depths of the furnace, the charred silhouette, the smoke man without a face, reached out of the flames with grasping, clawed fingers. Think about how terrifying it is to realize that you are completely disposable in the grand machinery of the world. You spend your entire life working, sweating, paying bills, and stressing over trivial deadlines, convinced that your existence holds some grand, irreplaceable value to the universe. Then you end up on a night shift in an abandoned mountain bore. You watch your name bleed onto a page from 1952 as your life is systematically erased. And you realize the world didn't need you to live, it only needed you to feed the fire when your page came up in the rotation, reducing your soul to mere fodder. The charred hand of the smoke man grasped my left shoulder. The grip was heavy, cold, and absolute, possessing the unyielding weight of a structural steel beam settling into a concrete foundation while crushing my collarbone into jagged splinters. It didn't pull me with brute, panicked force. It guided me forward with the calm, methodical precision of an archivist placing a finished volume back onto its designated shelf, offering no mercy or escape. My heavy work boots slid across the rough, soot-covered stone floor. 1 step. 2 steps. Until the tips of my boots touched the open metal lip of the firebox door, directly over the roaring, violet-tinged bed of burning coal that waited to tear my flesh apart. Look down at your own hands right now. Look at the lines on your palms, the skin stretched across your knuckles, the fingernails trimmed clean. How long do you think those hands will remain attached to a living pulse before the rot sets in? How many years before someone else takes your place in whatever room you're sitting in right now, wiping down your desk, throwing away your old notebooks, and clearing out your drawers for the next guy in line to suffer? We are all just temporary ink on a temporary page. And sooner or later, the shift supervisor comes down the hall with a key, the door opens, and the furnace demands its living fuel. The smoke man leaned in close to my ear, his breath smelling of 50-year-old ash and damp mountain stone, whispering promises of eternal suffering. "Time to close the book, Nick," he whispered with malicious delight. And with a single, effortless shove, he sent me tumbling headfirst into the roaring, flesh-melting fire.